Hello, I'm excited to talk to you today about bees in Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument. This is something that's excited and intrigued and inspired me for over 20 years, and I always enjoyed the opportunity to talk about this incredible place and the bees that call it home. Before I do, I want to make sure that when I say the word bee, we're all thinking about the same thing. These are bees. They come in all shapes and sizes, from smaller than a millimeter or two to larger than an inch, and in every imaginable color. They have incredible bodies, each bit of which serves some purpose in a bee's life, whether it's cleaning off their antenna, or building a nest, or harvesting pollen from flowers, or discouraging a predator with a sting. There's one in the center down near the bottom there that you may recognize. That is the honeybee, and it's the one that people think of most often when they think about a bee, but it doesn't really represent a bee's real life cycle. So let me talk about the native solitary bees that are so common in Grand Staircase. First, honeybees are not native. They were brought to North America by pilgrims some 400 years ago for the honey that they produce and for wax. And with the exception of a handful of other bees here, the bees found in Grand Staircase and actually across the US are all native. And here they've evolved and adapted to the desert environment in which they find themselves, and they've been adapting in this way for thousands or even millions of years. Second, honeybees are social. This means there's a queen whose job it is to lay eggs, and there's worker bees who take care of her and manage the hive and forage for resources and care for the queen's offspring, who are also their sisters. Grand Staircase's bees are by and large solitary, meaning that each female builds her own nest that she maintains. She gathers pollen and nectar for the offspring in that nest, and she lays her own eggs. In a sense, you can think of a solitary bee as both a queen and a worker honeybee all rolled into one. And finally, because the native solitary bees don't overwinter as adults, but as little tiny babies in their nest eating the pollen and nectar that their mama left for them, the bees in Grand Staircase-Escalante do not make honey. In fact, the honeybee is the only bee species in the country that makes honey. So most of these bees nest in the ground, and I put in this little video to show you what it looks like when a bee is working on her nest in the ground. This is one that's really common in Grand Staircase. It's a cactus specialist, a cactus bee, and they really like to nest in hard-packed roads. So here she is using her mandibles and her mouth parts to kind of chew at that really hard earth, and then using her front legs to kind of press at it and make the walls as smooth and perfect as possible, because she's going to put all of her offspring, all of her babies are going to grow up in that little nest, and she wants it to be just right. So here's another kind of bee that often nests down there. If they're not nesting in the ground, and in Grand Staircase about 70% of bees are ground nesters, but the rest of them nest in hollowed out twigs or pre-existing cavities and pieces of wood and things of that nature. And so they will also, of course, will nest in bee hotels if you build them like this one here. But this gives you a sense of what's in there. There's pollen for each of her offspring. So this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pollen masses. So there will be at least 5 eggs in here and more if she keeps going. And many of these bees are specialists, which means that even when there's a lot of different flowers in bloom in a place, the bee will limit itself to subset of what's available when gathering the pollen and nectar that it's going to bring back to feed to its offspring. So worldwide, there's between 20 and 30,000 bee species. In North America, we think there's somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000, and I'll explain why that number is kind of vague there in just a minute. And in Utah, there's over 1,000 species. We think maybe up to 1,100 species in Utah. Comparing that, so east of the Mississippi River, there's about 770 bee species total, which means that Utah alone has more than all of the eastern states combined. Even more amazing, little tiny Grand Staircase down here has over 660 bee species just in that area. And of those, among that incredible diversity, there are nearly 50 species that are new, meaning that when they were discovered over 20 years ago, those bees hadn't been named. Many of them still haven't been named by scientists, and they're relatively new discoveries in the insect world. With so many bee species, it may seem surprising that there are so many stories in the news hinting at bee declines. Many of those stories are based on periodic dips in the abundance of honeybees, but some of those stories are based on the fact that we know that some of the landscape level changes made to environments can't possibly be good for bees. So, for example, turning the Midwest prairies of the 1800s into corn and soybean fields has most definitely changed the availability of floral resources for bees there. Or putting in a paved parking lot has probably removed ground nesting habitat for many different kinds of bees. And spraying insecticides has to have some effect on all insects, which of course includes bees. The difficulty lies in quantifying the extent of any declines and determining which species are most affected by the changes that we make on a landscape. And to date, we really only have quantitative actual numbers on a few species of bumblebees and the honeybees. For the rest, we're still trying to figure it out. As with any group of organisms in a community that's changing, there are going to be winners who thrive when whatever conditions happen occur, and those who lose and don't do well with the habitat modifications that they encounter. I spend my summers trying to quantify bee species populations across the western United States. I drag my kids along whether they want to be there or not, and I usually can be found out swinging my net. I take a sample of the bees from different habitats or areas or on different plants, and I put little handles on them, that's what those pins are, and I look under a microscope to figure out which species I have, and then I share what I've learned with others. And my goal is to collect bees in some sort of standardized, steady, consistent way so that someone else can come behind me and do the same work in the same area and compare it to mine and see if there are any changes in bee richness or abundance. So we're able to better quantify changes when we collect in some sort of standardized way. So as an example, consider this beautiful bee, which can be found in Grand Staircase-Escalante. It's called Osmia aglaya. It's in the mason bee group. And let's say someone went out and collected in one area, say 58 individuals of this bee in the year 2020. If that's the only information we have, it's hard to determine the status of the bee. Depending on how many there were around 2000, it could be increasing in abundance, it could be decreasing in abundance, or maybe it's staying particularly consistent. I'm trying to provide the baseline, that 2000 data, so that future scientists can figure out where best to concentrate their conservation efforts. So bees that maybe are doing fine or staying the same, we don't need to spend as much time thinking about or put resources into. And ones that truly are experiencing declines are where we could concentrate. So Grand Staircase-Escalante was one of the first places where this sort of standardized bee work was conducted, and it's proving to be an incredible resource for assessing bee population trends in the present day. When we conducted our survey of the bees from the years 2000 to 2003, the goals were to be able to provide the monument and the BLM with information on what bees lived in the area, the floral resources they most used, and the habitats most important to them, so that when land managers had to make a decision, they could consider the impact on bees. Surveying bees in Grand Staircase was a huge undertaking. I used 8 incredible field assistants each year, I think I had over 40 by the time all was said and done, to collect bees in plots that measured 100 meters by 100 meters. So I set 48 of these plots up in total, and I did it in a wide variety of habitats found in Grand Staircase, and then we visited each and every one of those plots every 2 weeks from April through October. That's the whole flowering season. And in addition, if we saw an interesting plant outside of a plot, we'd stop and opportunistically collect on it to see if we found anything that wasn't in the plots. So, over the 4 years of the study, we collected over 80,000 individuals. And I know you're thinking that sounds like a lot, especially for a group that you think might be in decline, but it's less than you'd think. So 80,000 individuals divided by 4 years is about 20,000 individuals a year, and across a monument that measures almost 100 miles by 50 miles, it works out to about 1 teeny tiny individual bee per 100 acres per year. So I sometimes wonder if we should have taken a few more to get a better handle on things. We put in a total of 1,600 or so collecting days over those 4 years, and our plots turned out to be pretty representative of the monument, with 72% of all species collected in the monument being found in our plots, which are on this map represented by those little yellow squares. The orange areas are places we stopped just to see what might be on a plant or in an area that was interesting. I want to share with you a couple of the cool bees that we found there. This one is Anthophora pueblo, which is a digger bee that nests in the plentiful sandstone found in Grand Staircase. It's pretty unique. There aren't many bees that do this. This is Diadasia. It's a mallow specialist, so it only visits globe mallow. And it likes to build its nest with these adorable little chimneys at the entrance, and the males sleep in flowers at night. And this is Melisodes. This is a group, they're sometimes called longhorned bees. You can see why there. And they include many specialists on sort of the fall asters and sunflowers. And I just love the long antenna on those males. Overall, we found bees visiting over 375 different flowering plant species. And interestingly, some plants were especially great to find bees, likely because they're super abundant and widespread and profuse bloomers. The list of best bee plants includes some native species, but also some non-native species. Bees don't seem to care as long as it has nectar and pollen for them to give to their offspring. The habitats with the most bees included rabbitbrush dominated places, which had the most bee individuals, which makes sense considering it was one of our best plants for finding bees, but also riparian habitats, which didn't have as many individuals, but had a lot more species, so each one was represented by fewer individuals. And riparian habitats bloom consistently from year to year and seem to allow for predictable, sort of rich bee populations that don't have to move from year to year, so probably adds up to a lot of richness. Interestingly, bee populations change dramatically from year to year in what appears to be the natural way for them. So here are 4 different species and how many individuals were collected of each in the same area, so the same 100-meter plot across 4 years. And you can see that in some years there were lots of individuals, and some years maybe not so many. But note that this pattern is not the same for each bee. So while one bee is having a lower than normal year, the same year will be good for some other species. What's more, for the same species in 2 different plots, this variation is huge. So while the bee called Ceratina nanula is having an off year in one area of the monument, it may be doing fine somewhere else. So maybe Winnie the Pooh was trying to tell us something scientific when he commented on bee populations. Recently, my colleague Joe Wilson and I revisited Grand Staircase almost 20 years later, and we picked 12 plots to resample. We wanted to see if there were any notable changes in the bee populations after nearly 2 decades. On average, the number of species found in a plot hasn't changed much in 20 years in this sort of undisturbed area. So the blue bar there that you can see is the average number of species that were found in each of the plots that we revisited from 2000 to 2003, and 2019 is how many species were there, 20 years later. So you can see that the orange bar falls within the range, the average for what we found there from 2000 to 2003. What's cool about this is that Grand Staircase can now serve as a scientific control, an area with little disturbance that shows what bees do more or less naturally. And we can compare that with other areas experiencing maybe bigger environmental changes and see if their populations show different patterns. What's also interesting about this, and we're investigating this now to confirm, is that it appears that while the number of species in a plot didn't change, who these species were may shift over time, meaning that maybe bees go through some sort of natural succession in the same way that plants and overstories do. So we're working on figuring this out right now. So even 20 years later, Grand Staircase continues to hand out intriguing questions for me, and I'm excited to continue exploring the area and its bees for years to come. Because this is recorded, I can't answer any questions for you, but if you have any questions about this talk, feel free to reach out to me at one of the following websites, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.